weather warfare, weather wars. I've wondered, is any of this true? I know you have too. In April of 1997, Secretary of Defense William Cohen said there are terrorists at work who are, quote, engaging in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. Did you know there's a Russian company that actually sells typhoons? We're going to be talking about all of this and chemtrails and HARP and more with a guy who is really an expert in this field, who's going to cut through all of the internet nonsense to the truth, which is even scarier. Welcome, Jerry Smith, the author of Weather Warfare, to Dreamland, the military's plan to draft Mother Nature. Jerry, thanks for being with us.
Well, Whitley, thank you for having me.
Well, this is really very exciting stuff, and I guess the first place to start, and I'm just going to jump right in, is where I could start 50 places in your book. Let's start, though, with Nikola Tesla. Now, we're going to get folks into chemtrails a little later on. We're going to get into HARP. We're going to cover it all. I'm going to ask him where Katrina really came from. We're going to get into all of it. But let's start with earthquakes and modification of the earth, because we had the worst earthquake, one of the worst earthquakes in history a few years ago, killing 250,000 people. What did Nikola Tesla learn about earthquakes?
Tesla had generated his own earthquake one afternoon, which rather surprised and frightened him, and convinced him that earthquakes on demand was a very real possibility. And I described that in the book at some length, and even more at length in my previous book, HARP, The Ultimate Weapon of the Conspiracy, in that HARP and earthquakes and Tesla seem to all be balled up together. Tesla was probably the greatest genius of his generation, and of the 46 basic patents in AC power, he holds 45 of them. The General Electric, the multinational conglomerate, was created by Edison to lease the right to use Tesla's AC patents. So the world we live in is a Tesla world, and yet he's been written out of the history books for the large part, and his earthquake work is equally as forgotten, I'm afraid.
Is it forgotten or hidden? Because it's weird that this man who was so important is carefully written out of the history books. And didn't the FBI seize a lot of his records after he died?
There's a great deal of debate as to what really happened with his records. We know that he was living in hotel rooms and that there were multiple trunks left behind. There was a branch of the federal government collected them up, not necessarily the FBI, but a branch that deals with foreign nationals. Even though he was a naturalized U.S. citizen, he was also a Serbian, today's, what was Yugoslavia, and actually it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire when he was born there. These things have a tendency to change their borders a lot. And the Yugoslavian government got back a couple of trunks, and there's a great deal of debate as to whether or not other government agencies kept a couple more trunks.
So it could be that this material was recognized as extremely sensitive even back that far. Now, we are in a state of complete weather upheaval right now. Part of it seems to be due to global warming, but there are other things that you talk about, like the so-called Jupiter effect and the Venus passage. Could you talk a little bit about the larger picture in terms of heating up and of the Earth and changing of the Earth's climate?
Oh, I'd love to. It's an area I've always been fascinated with, and I cover as great a detail in the book as I can. Long-scale climate change is not very well addressed by mainstream science these days. You have some paleoclimatologists who are trying to figure it out, but the main thing they rely on is ice cores, and where the poles are now, where there is deep ice now, has only been there for about 750,000 years at the top. So it's hard for them to get a handle on what happened before that period of time. And then again, you consider humanity. Homo sapien sapien has only existed for 180,000 years or so. And so we have really only lived through part of one major climate cycle, which is one ice age. We came out of one ice age something like 11,600 years ago, and most of human history is in this time period since the ice age ended. And so modern meteorology has some ID fixes that make it difficult for them to get it right, because they have this idea today of norms and averages, and they average out their data, and they don't recognize the fact that their baseline doesn't really exist, that their baseline is a floating decimal point. And that makes it really difficult for them to get a handle on what happened more than 20 years ago, more than 20 years in the future. And what we've seen is that in terms of intentional human manipulation of the weather, humans have been intentionally manipulating the weather over North America for 130 years. The scientific community has been intentionally tinkering with it on pretty much a daily basis for about 60 years. And the butterfly effect may be at work here. Chaos theory tells us that effects do not die out at a distance, but accumulate at a distance. And the famous phrase, the butterfly effect, was coined by a meteorologist, a climatologist in the 70s, who suggested that perhaps the flapping of the wings of a butterfly in Peru could set off a chain of events that 2-3 years later ended up in a tornado in Kansas. And we have intentional human meddling on top of these cycles that science is having trouble dealing with, such as the sunspot cycle. Much of the talk of global warming is based on a baseline of the last 150 years. And yeah, the last 150 years, the Earth has been getting warmer in cycles of warmer, cooler, warmer, cooler. It was getting warmer from about 1900 to about 1940. Then it cooled down from 1940 to about 1980. And in the 70s, we had all this talk of global cooling. And then in the 80s, it started warming up again. And that change may indeed be due to either increased sunspots or increased persistent contrails. A curious thing is that we got persistent contrails starting in the 80s due to the development of the high bypass turbofan. And a curious thing about contrails and chemtrails that we're going to be getting into a bit later that focuses on this is that as the air warms, it can hold more moisture, and the more moisture it can hold, the more it can contribute to the persistence of a contrail. And so it's been a self-perpetuating feedback loop in which more contrails have produced more contrails, which have produced more contrails, which have produced more warming, which has produced more contrails. And that has altered the climate over North America substantially. In fact, the head of meteorology at MIT suggested that all of the warming over North America seen in the last 20 years is attributable to persistent contrails, chemtrails, if you will. And again, we have this question of major cycles. The solar cycle may be what's really driving all this, in that we're coming up out of a period called the Little Ice Age, which lasted from about 1500 to about 1800, in which the coldest was, I believe, 1635, when there was 3 feet of ice on the Thames at London. For the last 150 years, we've been gradually warming up coming out of this. And during the Little Ice Age, none of the observers around the planet observed sunspots on the sun during that period. It's known as the Marauder minimum. And then, date coincident with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the sunspots start appearing, and the Earth starts getting warmer. And so the folks who are yapping about global warming right now are saying that it's in the Industrial Revolution that have done it. But since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, each sunspot cycle has gotten more violent.
Well, we are, according to NASA, we are coming up on the next sunspot cycle, which should start in 2011, and they are telling us that it's going to be conceivably the biggest sunspot cycle in history. What does that
Absolutely
mean?
Well, what that means is that we have no clue what's going to happen, but there seems to be an awful lot of things falling into that 2012 doomsday.
I've noticed that too. It's really amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot just falling into it. It's you just have to wonder, you know.
Right, and I've been talking with the Planet X Nibiru people, and they're saying it's going to come by in 2012. We've got the pole shift people saying the next pole shift is in 2012, and there's possibly some evidence to this. One of the things that's happening is that the solar system is passing through the plane of the ecliptic of the galaxy. And
yes.
some folks are saying that, you know how in the northern hemisphere of the Earth, that when you flush the toilet, the water turns one way, and when we go to the other hemisphere, it turns the other way. They're saying that now that we're above the plane of the ecliptic, we're spinning one way, but when we go below the plane of the ecliptic, we're going to reverse our spin. This I think is brilliant nonsense, but a number of people are climbing on this bandwagon.
Well, exactly, and it probably isn't going to happen quite that way. But even without the more speculative stuff, the fact remains that even some of the best scientists in the world are looking at a rapidly changing situation, and there is every evidence that sunspot cycles cause significant short-term warming, and that this is going to come in 2011 and 2012 at a time when it's liable to be a tripwire that's going to accelerate the whole global warming process, which we don't understand anyway, to a breakneck speed from it's already going 3 times faster than they thought. So we don't even need the way-out speculations to say that 2012 is going to be a really perky year. Okay, we're getting to the end of the first segment. We're going to come back, and when we come back, we're going to start getting into the nitty-gritty of this thing. Weather warfare, is it real? Who's doing it? What do we have to watch out for? Jerry's website is really cool. You can go on it whenever you want to. It's jerrysmith.com. That's no WW in front of it, just jerrysmith.com. His book,
Jerry E. Smith.
There's an E in there, folks. Whitley is very good at mispronouncing things and misstating websites. I'm famous for it. So note that, jerrysmith.com. All one thing, jerrysmith.com. His book, Weather Warfare, the Military's Plan to Draft Mother Nature, just about the best thing I've ever read on this subject. Do not miss it. You can get it from UnknownCountry.com's Amazon store. You can get it from your bookstore. You can get it from Adventures Unlimited Press. But get it. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Jerry Smith, Weather Warfare, the military's plan to draft Mother Nature. Just about the best book on this subject I've ever read. Jerry's website, jerryesmith.com. That's jerryesmith.com. Jerry, we were beginning to talk about chemtrails at the end of last segment. Let's get into this now a little bit more, and later we're going to be talking about things like hurricanes and typhoons and the bizarre typhoons that are marching and hurricanes marching the world these days, and what do they have to do with weather warfare. But first, let's just get into the chemtrails thing and really get into it seriously. I'm going to start us off by mentioning or reminding everyone who doesn't know perhaps that Dr. Edward Teller, the father of the nuclear age, arguably the father of the atom bomb, postulated some years ago that if we were to spread particulate matter, reflective particulate matter in the upper atmosphere, we might conceivably be able to slow down global warming. Now, starting from there, and then I want to get into military communications that use chemtrails. Let's do it all, Jerry, and you know all of this too. So let's go, and I'd like to first ask you, what is a chemtrail, and are they real?
Wow. That is such a loaded question, in that the U.S. government says chemtrails is a hoax. And, of course, if you believe in a hoax, you're an idiot. So the government says, if you talk about chemtrails, you're an idiot, so I try not to talk about them. So,
okay,
but
in the world I live in, if you believe the United States government, you're an idiot. So that's where I'm coming from.
I have to agree with that absolutely completely. But, I try to be credible and mainstream when it's nearly impossible, but I try anyhow. Chemtrails is a theory that the persistent contrails we're seeing have some secret additive that turns them from contrails into chemtrails, and that the secret additive is to further some nefarious agenda. And there are a good dozen theories as to what these nefarious agendas might be, and some of which are seen as good and some of which are seen as evil. Some folks believe that we are being immunized against potential bioterror attack. Some think that we are under bioterror attack. Some of the theories are that this is strictly a military operation. Others are that it's geoengineering to save us from global warming. And my personal favorite, which I find hilarious, is that the Earth is being geoengineered, that the atmosphere is being changed so that when our alien overlords get here, they'll be able to breathe the air that used to be ours.
Look, we have got plans to terraform Mars ourselves. And so I personally, having had 11 years of close encounters, don't discount that theory at all.
Cool. I thought you might say something like that. Every once in a while, it hits me and I go, yeah, that's it. Most of the time, I try to maintain a more "what can I prove" attitude. And indeed, my book Weather Warfare is 400 pages of what I can prove. And on the subject we're talking about in this segment,
which is what makes it so stunning, folks. Because what he can prove is curling my hair. Go ahead.
Okay, so what I can prove about I break it down into the problem with contrails, which is persistent contrails are a significant environmental problem, and theories of intentional atmospheric releases. And I can prove that since the 1950s, there have been hundreds of programs to engage in intentional atmospheric releases. Many of these are readily available in the open scientific and military literature. And then, so I look at particularly Dr. Teller's proposal. And what I can prove on Dr. Teller's proposal is that starting around 1979, famed physicist Freeman Dyson suggested that if global warming really were caused by greenhouse gases, that this would be an easy thing to mitigate. And the basic greenhouse gas theory is that since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have created these gases like CO2 that go to the top of the atmosphere and act like the panes of glass in a greenhouse, allowing solar energy, solar heat in, and then trapping the heat and not permitting it to go back out again. And Dyson's concept was really stunningly simple. Just make the greenhouse shinier. Make the Earth shinier so that less solar energy gets in the first place. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory has looked at this at great length. Edward Teller was the associate director and one of the founders of Lawrence Livermore. He wrote an article on this subject for Dow Jones, or for the Wall Street Journal, in which he proposed putting up a sunscreen to save the Earth from global warming. And Lawrence Livermore has spent more than 20 years and more than $200 million looking at global warming mitigation schemes. And they've come up with quite a few, and some of which it boils down to either putting mirrors in space or putting shiny dust at the top of the atmosphere so as to reflect more solar energy back. Indeed, when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released the first stage of their three-stage report in February this year, just before it got released, the Guardian newspaper in the UK got leaked the U.S. response to it, and the U.S. begged the IPCC to put in mitigation as a viable alternative to emission control. And the Guardian article had the hilarious title of U.S. Response to Global Warming, smoke and giant space mirrors. And that's really
the giant space mirrors thing has come up again just recently.
Oh yeah, it's the number 2 best guess. Lawrence Livermore has come up with about 20 of these best guesses, and a couple of them I just find hilarious. One was, and this was seriously proposed to the President of the United States in a closed-door meeting last spring. Lawrence Livermore proposed building a fleet of thousands of robot sailboats that would be solar-powered and run on computers, and they would sail back and forth across the world's oceans outside of normal shipping lanes, and they would have on board solar-powered fog generators, and they would generate vast billowing blankets of fog behind them, turning the world's oceans into shiny blankets to reflect more solar energy back so as to mitigate global warming. What I can prove is that not only did Lawrence Livermore spend a great deal of time and money looking at this, but other scientific bodies joined in, like SRI, Stanford Research Institute. And Stanford Research Institute not only went on board with it, but their monthly legal magazine actually had an article proposing an environmental Manhattan Project, something that would be as secret and as big as the Manhattan Project, which gave us the atom bomb, because the reason they proposed doing this all secretly is that the world scientific bodies that have looked at this have gone, yeah, putting shiny dust in the atmosphere might work. We do have this technology. We probably could do it. It probably would be cost effective, but, and they all come up with the same buts, the legal and environmental hurdles would be so high they could never do it and tell anybody about it. And that's where the paper trail ends. And that's where SRI came in and said, well, we should go forward with doing it and just not tell anybody about it. So that is my best guess as to what chemtrails are, is that somebody somewhere did indeed decide that it would be okay to go forward with it, even and simply keep it a secret.
Now, let me bring up a couple of things, because I want to now shift into the military communications area. After 9/11, all aircraft flights in the United States were grounded, and the only thing that you could see over the United States, over the American Midwest, were jets at very high altitude flying back and forth, spewing contrails. Now, flash backwards a little bit to the the NATO intervention in Serbia in the Kosovo War, and the area was literally swept by massive numbers of contrails, massive numbers. So could you comment on the uses of these contrails in for military purposes, possibly for military communications?
Oh, certainly. The open military and scientific literature has a lot of material on this, and I quote a few from it. One of the things they found, one of the things they've been working on for some time is both over-the-horizon radar and secure communication channels. And they found that through doing barium releases, that barium striate, that is, the atmosphere is like a parfait. It's a layer of cold on top of a layer of warm air, on top of a layer of cold air, on top of a layer of warm air, and that if you release something like aluminum or barium at one of these boundary layers, it will sheet out. It will turn into a flat plane, which you can then bounce electromagnetic signals off of, so you can have very tightly controlled communication channels or do over-the-horizon radar. And this has been a developing technology for almost 50 years now, and is a standard part of the arsenal at this point.
Which they use without regard, of course, for its effects on our atmosphere. You can be assured that as weak as the EPA is, there is no environmental study on what this may or may not be doing to us, and our welfare is entirely secondary. Okay, we're going to come back, and when we do come back, we're going to start getting into Katrina and other storms. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. This is Whitley Strieber. We're back with Jerry E. Smith Weather Warfare, the military's plan to draft Mother Nature, his phenomenal, explosive book, available from the unknowncountry.com Amazon store, available from Adventures Unlimited Press, available in your local bookstore. Do not miss this. You need this education. This is important. The truth shall make us free, and there is truth in this book. Jerry's website, jerryesmith.com. That's just input jerryesmith.com. You'll jump right to it. Learn what is going on. And in view of that, Jerry, I want to talk a little bit about weather modification legislation. We laughed a bit earlier about the United States government and the fact that I am not a believer. Well, what abductee would be? I mean, we see what happens to us, and we see what they say about it, and we know they're a bunch of lying swine. And since this is a subscriber-supported radio program on the Internet, out of Canada, I don't care what I say. I'll say the truth, and that's it. Okay, so let's go on. NMOD legislation. Can you tell us what that is and its significance?
Absolutely. NMOD is a contraction for environmental modification. And NMOD legislation in the U.S. tracks back to about the late 1960s. And there was a key a piece of it that is a major watershed in the history of the U.S. and the world. And it has a precursor, so let me give you the precursor, which was weather was used as a weapon during the Vietnam War. It was called Operation Popeye. Operation Popeye was an attempt to extend the monsoon season in Southeast Asia by cloud seeding over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in hopes of turning the Viet Cong resupply route into a hopeless quagmire of mud. Operation Popeye first hit public consciousness via Jack Anderson's syndicated column in the Washington Post or the New York Post, I forget which now, in 1971. And the world kind of reeled when this came up, and Senator Claiborne Pell, Democrat, Rhode Island, launched an investigation in 72. And he pulled in then Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, and Laird lied to him and said, oh, no, the United States wouldn't do anything like that. No, that's just silliness. 2 years later, a private letter from Laird got leaked to the press in which Laird admitted that he had lied to Congress and that Operation Popeye was real and had been ongoing. Pell then reconvenes his investigation, but by this time Laird has left Secretary of Defense position and is a private lawyer in a consultation with Richard Nixon, who was fighting for his political life in the aftermath of the Watergate break-ins. And the Pentagon refuses to answer any questions unless Pell agrees to do it as a closed-door secret session, which he does. Then a couple of spokesdroids from the Pentagon troop over to Capitol Hill, and they admit Operation Popeye had been ongoing for 8 years, that they had expended 47,000 units of cloud seeding material over 4 countries, North and South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the last two in violation of international law, and at a price of about $21.6 million. At that point, Pell was just floored by what he was hearing and demanded to know what else the DoD, Department of Defense, were doing, and got a veritable laundry list of crazy things, NMOD technologies that the DoD was working on, including intentionally melting polar ice and intentionally thinning out the ozone layer over enemy populations so that the enemy population would be sickened through increased exposure to solar radiation. This really set Pell off, and he went on a crusade to make an international treaty banning the world's military from using the environment as a weapon. And that treaty did get signed into law and is now the law of this earth. It is now a crime against humanity to use any geophysical natural process as a weapon. And the treaty.
That doesn't stop governments from, crime against humanity is just a misdemeanor. That's less than a parking ticket to most governments. So
the The convention is called the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or Any Other Hostile Use of Environmental Modification Techniques, also known as the NMOD Convention. And you're quite right. I have about a 60-page analysis of the NMOD Convention, and that is an absolute horrible failure. Only 70 nations have signed on to it. It's unenforceable in any realistic sense. Now, the watershed mark here is not that this treaty came into existence, but prior to the treaty, the U.S. federal government was spending between $40 and $140 million a year on developing this technology and had over 700 degreed scientists working on developing NMOD technology. And then we signed the treaty, and suddenly the federal budget goes to zero, and all these jobs disappear. And we're expected to believe that Uncle Sam says, oh, can't do that anymore, and just goes off and does something else, when it's very clear that what happened is that it went off budget. It went to euphemized projects, and HARP is a grand example of euphemized projects, and it went to civilian contractors. And a good proof of the civilian contractor angle is one of the nation's largest corporations dealing with weather modification is named Weather Modification Incorporated of Fargo, North Dakota. This is a multi-million-dollar corporation with clients across the U.S. and around the world, and they are doing hail suppression in Argentina, snowpack enhancement for ski resorts in Sun Valley, Idaho, cloud seeding in Nevada. Most of their clients are government agencies or big farming agribusinesses.
Now, given their abilities... go ahead, Jerry. I'm sorry.
Okay, one last little bit here is 2005, one of the senior scientists from Weather Modification Incorporated went on Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM show and outed himself as having been one of the senior scientists in Operation Popeye. This is proof that NMOD has been turned over to civilian contractors. And that's how Uncle Sam keeps Congress from knowing what he's doing.
Right. Well, that was going on even when I was involved with in the UFO thing. I found that not only was the work being turned over to defense contractors and therefore taken out of the context of entirely out of the context of oversight, but even the records were being given to EG&G Rotron and stored in a facility under Rosendale and Woodstock, from that gigantic underground facility that stretches between Woodstock and Rosendale, New York. A lot of records were being stored there, and then I found out that the most sensitive records were actually stored in areas owned by the Archdiocese of New York, so to make further sure that they would never be accessed, even by congressional investigators going into the facility.
Exactly. I've run into that same thing.
So that's where we are with that. Now, we brushed over the earthquake issue a little bit earlier. Now, I want to go directly to it, and I'm going to bring you two pieces of information. First, I'm going to ask you straight out, what was the great earthquake in Asia? Was that something? Could that have been something somebody caused? And second, I watch the U.S. Geologic Survey's earthquake site daily. A couple of weeks ago, a group of about 12 4.0, around 3.5 to 4.2 earthquakes occurred in Northern California, all within a very tight sequence of time, within an hour or so of each other. Then the next day, these earthquakes disappeared from the record. They were gone. Now, first, let's ask the Katrina question. The tsunami question. Could that have been something that was induced because it had some very strange after effects, like there were aftershocks felt on the Chilean coast that actually went entirely through the planet. So what was going on there?
Well, you touch on a subject that is very keen to my heart, and one which I tried to nail. And again, my book, Weather Warfare, is 400 pages of what I can prove. And
right. We're going to go a little bit beyond that now.
I just touch on it in the book because I couldn't really prove anything. One of the things I can prove specifically about earthquakes is that there are half a dozen different ways that earthquakes can be induced by humans. Mainstream science recognizes that humans can inadvertently create earthquakes a half a dozen different ways, including setting atom bombs on fault lines, injecting fluids into the earth, extracting fluids from the earth, building giant reservoirs, and so forth. And, of course, my contention is if they can do it once accidentally, they can do it the second time on purpose. Now, one of the things that I detailed at great length was Project Faultless. Project Faultless is the best documented case of an atom bomb creating an earthquake, and it gives us a lot of dots to connect to the other events that have followed since. Project Faultless, the Nevada test site, the NTS, is about 90 miles north of Las Vegas. And initially, the nukes were set off above ground, and that was seen as part of the whole experience of going to Vegas. And then after the limited test ban treaty went into effect, the nukes went underground, and as the bombs got bigger, the city, Las Vegas, rocked and rolled more, and eventually it got to the point where it was rattling the buildings and rattled Howard Hughes, who owned several casinos. And he got tired of his customers being frightened and his glass being broken and went to the NTS and told them to knock that stuff off. And they decided to try moving the NTS to another location for the really big nukes. And they looked at two sites, one in the Kamchatka Islands and one in central Nevada. And they were hoping that the central Nevada site would work out better than having to go off the Aleutians. And they set off one bomb there, which turned out to be the largest bomb ever set off in the continental United States. And that bomb was intentionally placed on a fault to see if they could set it off. And, of course, the arrogance of DOD scientists knows no end, and they assumed that, of course, a human couldn't set off an earthquake, so they named the project Faultless. Well, it not only did it, and the bomb was set off 3,200 feet below the surface. When the bomb went off, the surface jumped 15 feet into the air and caused breaks on the fault line it was on for thousands of feet in both directions, with some displacements as much as 10 feet, and set off the fault on the other side of the valley with similar results and dropped the valley floor by an average of 8 feet. Now, as to whether one of the things that they discovered in this, and has now been repeatedly discovered, is that natural earthquakes and atom bombs have different seismic signatures. Indeed, you may recall when India tried to join the Atomic Club back in the 70s, they faked an atom bomb. They faked a test in which they had a very large conventional weapon salted with radioactive materials to make it look like they'd set off a bomb. And the real members of the nuclear club went wink, wink, nudge, nudge to each other. The thing that I find most disturbing about the Asian tsunami is that the seismic signature was the signature of an atom bomb rather than the signature of a natural earthquake.
Wow, I did not know that. We're going to be taking a very brief break here. And folks, remember, I reminded you earlier, Jerry will be live in the subscriber chat room next weekend at 10 to 11 Pacific time. That is next Saturday, 10 to 11 Pacific time. So don't miss that. That is going to be really worth doing. And if you're not a subscriber to Unknown Country, you're in a big crowd, because 9 out of 10 listeners to Dreamland do not subscribe and don't support the website, and that's fine. The show's free for a reason. Some of you can't afford it. A lot of you can. And remember, it's free like this in more ways than one. We're listening to this in-depth interview of this type because it's not beholden to anybody except the listeners. You make the rules here. Okay, we'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. We're talking to Jerry E. Smith, Weather Warfare, the military's plan to draft Mother Nature. Incredible stuff, really powerful, and important. His website, jerryesmith.com. Do not miss this. Get this book. Get it from UnknownCountry.com's Amazon store. Get it from AdventuresUnlimitedPress.com. Get it from your local bookstore, but get it. Get involved. Learn what this is all about. And frankly, it's just incredibly, I'm so curious about what weather warfare is really all about. And we're learning a lot today. And there's much, much more that he has to offer in this book. It's very credible. He never goes beyond what he can prove, and as you are hearing, what he can prove is absolutely shocking. Shocking. Just as we left the air, we were talking about, and I'm told, incidentally, that chat is, the date of it is the 23rd of June. So that'll be June 23rd, 10 to 11 Pacific time. Jerry Smith will be with us in the subscriber chat room. Okay. Now, before we left, we were just beginning to talk about the fact that the Great Asian earthquake that caused the tsunami had an atomic bomb-like signature. Could you go on with that, Jerry?
That's an area that I do not have a lot of technical expertise in. I'm not sure I could go much further on that. I got this material from Dr. Rosalie Bertell. Dr. Bertell is one of my heroes. Dr. Bertell has 6 PhDs. She led the medical examination in Bhopal after the Union Carbide disaster. She led the medical examination into Chernobyl, into Kiev after the Chernobyl disaster. She's won scores of awards from major humanitarian groups. She's been one of the leading lights in the anti-nuke movement for most of my life, and she's a Catholic nun. This girl is really amazing. She's written 2 books.
Boy, she sounds like a good Dreamland guest.
Oh, she would be a wonderful Dreamland guest. She wrote 2 books. You can expect
to hear her soon, folks.
She wrote 2 books, which I reference on my website and in the bibliography of my book. My book's bibliography is 31 pages long. Rosalie wrote No Immediate Danger, Prognosis for a Radioactive Earth, and Planet Earth, the Latest Weapon of War. Now, both were published in England. They're a little hard to get in the U.S. I highly recommend them. In fact, the latter one, Planet Earth, the Latest Weapon of War, is really the middle section of my book. I was going to put a lot of stuff on depleted uranium and so forth in, and realized that she'd already written it. She'd written the definitive text on it, so I just left it to her. So she, as a nuke specialist, was the one who analyzed the seismic signatures of the Asian tsunami and was instantly said, yeah, that's a nuke. That's not natural. So if she says it, I'm willing to bow my head to that.
Okay, so that's where we are with that. Now let
me give you a tie-in to
please.
this. There was a tsunami bomb developed during World War II. And this just came out. The paperwork was kept secret like 55 years. It was just released, I think, in 98 or 99, declassified, just before the turn of the century by the New Zealand government. The New Zealand government during World War II had a project called Project SEAL to develop a tsunami bomb, in which the head of the project was an Australian scientist on loan to New Zealand. And, many technologies were under development during the war that didn't get done in time to be used in the war, like Howard Hughes' Spruce Goose. The tsunami bomb was successfully tested in 46 and 47, a little too late to be used in the war. When the U.S. DOD learned of it, they invited the head of the project to come to the Bikini Atoll test so that to see if there was a link between their nuke work and his tsunami work. And he respectfully declined. And the DOD guys went to his lab in outside Auckland, went through his work, and sent back an enthusiastic memo to the Pentagon saying that if this bomb had been developed in time to be used during the war, it could have played as significant a role, or possibly even more significant a role, than the atom bomb. And yet the tsunami bomb just sort of went away. Or did it?
Or did it, exactly. Well, maybe we found that out a few years ago. But, of course, then you have to ask, what motive would there be? But there are a lot of motives out there, folks, and among them, we haven't even gotten into biowarfare or anything like that, which he at least touches on in this book. We're strictly staying with weather modification. And I mentioned a moment ago this strange disappearance of this group of earthquakes from the USGS site. What would, when you hear something like that, does that ring any kind of an alarm bell in your mind at all?
You know, I know a lot of seismologists. I live in Reno, Nevada, and we have a major seismology lab there. And seismologists are a very picky sort. They want their equipment to work, and they want their readings to be absolutely perfect. And if there isn't a reading they can agree on, they pull it. And there are lots of earthquakes that may or may not happen. The seismic equipment picks up stuff, and it goes directly to the site. The seismographs are live to the various websites, and if you read, you'll see that at the top it says this data has not been examined by a seismologist. Until it actually is examined by a seismologist, it's questionable. I mean, it could be a bridge falling down. It could be a truck full of dynamite exploding. And so there often are false reads that get erased, and maybe there are real ones that get erased too. But that's the beauty of Mother Nature. She gives such great credible deniability.
That's right. Beautiful, credible deniability compliments of Mother Nature, and we're left to really not know what that was. But a series of 12 quakes. I mean, I'm aware of the fact that quakes get pulled off of there fairly often. I mean, once or twice a month, maybe. I mean, I'm sure that plenty of them I've not noticed. But when you see a whole group of them like that, and it was a significant number. It wasn't one or two. I'm
right.
saying,
you're quite right. It could have been a test they didn't want the world to know about.
Well, exactly.
And of course, until the paperwork gets declassified 60 years from now, we won't know.
If it ever does get declassified, because as we explored a little bit earlier, a lot of things that they don't want to ever show simply are hidden away, or in the case of the great 1977 records fire in St. Louis, right before the Freedom of Information Act went into effect, records like the entire output of all records from the Roswell Army Air Base from 1947 to 1952 were apparently destroyed or lost. That is the modus operandi for things that they don't want to ever be seen is to destroy, lose, or place them in private hands. And that is routinely done. And if folks, we're coming to the end of our time with Jerry, and I want to remind you, Weather Warfare, the military's plan to draft Mother Nature. It's a sobering, exciting, extraordinary book. Get it from our Amazon store. Get it from Adventures Unlimited Press. Get it from your local bookstore, but do get it, because you not only do you need to be educated, it's like an unbelievable eye-opener, because we all live with these rumors that we see on the Internet that are never really very well followed up. Well, they're well followed up here, and there is more than a smoking gun. This is serious, serious stuff. Jerry's website, jerryesmith.com. He'll be in the subscriber section on the 23rd, 10 to 11 a.m. Pacific, answering your questions live. Jerry, it's been absolutely great having you with us. And if you got a last word, you've got about a minute or so left, so let's use it. A last word, if you will, for our listeners.
Well, we covered only a tiny fraction of what's in the book. The book is 400 pages of what I can prove, and I think we covered about 40 pages.
About 40. That's absolutely correct.
There's an awful lot more going on out there, in plain sight, available in the open literature. I try to document it and bring it to the reader's attention. I would like them to visit my website. The website has a lot of information so they can continue their researches from there. Most of the bibliography is up on the website.
You know, Jerry, it occurs to me that we're really not finished, in a sense that we haven't even talked about HAARP. And if you have an extra half hour right now, could we continue on, and we will post this in our subscriber section the next half hour. Do you have the time? If not, we can do it later.
I'd love to.
Next week on Dreamland, don't miss David Ray Griffin. His latest book on the 9/11 conspiracy will blow your socks all the way.
There for about 750,000 years at the top, so it's hard for them to get a handle on what happened before that period of time. And then again, you consider humanity. Homo sapien sapien has only existed for 180,000 years or so, and so we have really only lived through part of one major climate cycle, which is one ice age. We came out of one ice age something like 11,600 years ago, and most of human history is in this time period since the ice age ended. And so modern meteorology has some ID fixes that make it difficult for them to get it right, because they have this idea today of norms and averages, and they average out their data, and they don't recognize the fact that their baseline doesn't really exist, that their baseline is a floating decimal point. And that makes it really difficult for them to get a handle on what happened more than 20 years ago, more than 20 years in the future. And what we've seen is that in terms of intentional human manipulation of the weather, humans have been intentionally manipulating the weather over North America for 130 years. The scientific community has been intentionally tinkering with it on pretty much a daily basis for about 60 years. And the butterfly effect may be at work here. Chaos theory tells us that effects do not die out at a distance, but accumulate at a distance. And the famous phrase, the butterfly effect, was coined by a meteorologist, a climatologist in the 70s, who suggested that perhaps the flapping of the wings of a butterfly in Peru could set off a chain of events that 2-3 years later ended up in a tornado in Kansas. And we have intentional human meddling on top of these cycles that science is having trouble dealing with, such as the sunspot cycle. Much of the talk of global warming is based on a baseline of the last 150 years. And the last 150 years, the Earth has been getting warmer in cycles of warmer, cooler, warmer, cooler. It was getting warmer from about 1900 to about 1940. Then it cooled down from 1940 to about 1980. And in the 70s, we had all this talk of global cooling. And then in the 80s, it started warming up again. And that change may indeed be due to either increased sunspots or increased persistent contrails. A curious thing is that we got persistent contrails starting in the 80s due to the development of the high bypass turbofan. And a curious thing about contrails and chemtrails that we're going to be getting into a bit later that focuses on this is that as the air warms, it can hold more moisture, and the more moisture it can hold, the more it can contribute to the persistence of a contrail. And so it's been a self-perpetuating feedback loop in which more contrails have produced more contrails, which have produced more. The federal government collected them up, not necessarily the FBI, but a branch that deals with foreign nationals. Even though he was a naturalized U.S. citizen, he was also a Serbian, today's what was Yugoslavia, and actually, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire when he was born there. These things have a tendency to change their borders a lot. And the Yugoslavian government got back a couple of trunks, and there's a great deal of debate as to whether or not other government agencies kept a couple more trunks.
So it could be that this material was recognized as extremely sensitive even back that far. Now, we are in a state of complete weather upheaval right now. Part of it seems to be due to global warming, but there are other things that you talk about, like the so-called Jupiter effect and the Venus passage. Could you talk a little bit about the larger picture in terms of heating up and of the Earth and changing of the Earth's climate?
Oh, I'd love to. It's an area I've always been fascinated with, and I cover as great a detail in the book as I can. Long-scale climate change is not very well addressed by mainstream science these days. You have some paleoclimatologists who are trying to figure it out, but the main thing they rely on is ice cores, and where the poles are now, where there is deep ice now, has only been the
earthquakes in history a few years ago, killing 250,000 people. What did Nikola Tesla learn about earthquakes?
Tesla had generated his own earthquake one afternoon, which rather surprised and frightened him, and convinced him that earthquakes on demand was a very real possibility. And I described that in the book at some length, and even more at length in my previous book, HAARP, The Ultimate Weapon of the Conspiracy, in that HAARP and earthquakes and Tesla seem to all be balled up together. Tesla was probably the greatest genius of his generation, and of the 46 basic patents in AC power, he holds 45 of them. The General Electric, the multinational conglomerate, was created by Edison to lease the right to use Tesla's AC patents. So the world we live in is a Tesla world, and yet he's been written out of the history books for the large part, and his earthquake work is equally as forgotten, I'm afraid.
Is it forgotten or hidden? Because it's weird that this man who was so important is carefully written out of the history books. And didn't the FBI seize a lot of his records after he died?
There's a great deal of debate as to what really happened with his records. We know that he was living in hotel rooms and that there were multiple trunks left behind. There was a branch of the
weather warfare, weather wars. I've wondered, is any of this true? I know you have too. In April of 1997, Secretary of Defense William Cohen said there are terrorists at work who are, quote, engaging in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. Did you know there's a Russian company that actually sells typhoons? We're going to be talking about all of this and chemtrails and HAARP and more with a guy who is really an expert in this field, who's going to cut through all of the internet nonsense to the truth, which is even scarier. Welcome, Jerry Smith, the author of Weather Warfare, to Dreamland, the military's plan to draft Mother Nature. Jerry, thanks for being with us.
Well, Whitley, thank you for having me.
Well, this is really very exciting stuff, and I guess the first place to start, and I'm just going to jump right in, is where I could start 50 places in your book. Let's start, though, with Nikola Tesla. Now, we're going to get folks into chemtrails a little later on. We're going to get into HAARP. We're going to cover it all. I'm going to ask him where Katrina really came from. We're going to get into all of it. But let's start with earthquakes and modification of the earth, because we had the worst earthquake, one of the worst